We've just opened up the webinar, so I'll just wait a few seconds as people are logging on before saying a few words of welcome to you all. Thank you for being here. I'm seeing the numbers rise now. So great that you could join us again for part 2 in this conversation series. All right, so I'll just get cracking. My name is Anna. Hello, welcome everybody. Welcome panelists and audience members alike. On behalf of all of us behind the scenes, thank you for joining us today in such large numbers. We're seeing them rise now. It has been a pleasure for us at ForeSpace to collaborate with Concordia University Advancement to bring you the second installment in our 2-part US presidential election series. If you missed part 1, a recording of that conversation is available on our channels, and I'll post a link to that in the chat in just a minute. Concordia University's ForeSpace is in essence the front door to the university. All of our activities are free and open to the public with the aim of facilitating access through interactive experiences to what our faculty members, researchers, and students are working on. We also collaborate with our alumni community and UA colleagues, and to that end, today's interdisciplinary and collaborative conversation between alumni and professors is especially exciting for us. Before passing proceedings off to our moderator, just a few notes. This event is being recorded once again and will be available on our website shortly, concordia.ca/4, the number 4. We're also live streaming on Facebook, so you can check it out at CU ForeSpace. Feel free to post any comments and questions there, and we'll relay them to our moderator here. The chat function in the Zoom webinar has been activated for your comments and your reflections throughout. However, if you have a burning question that you'd like our moderator and panelists to address, we ask you to pose it in the Q&A proper. This will signal to us that it's a question to be addressed publicly, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. Thank you. So without further delay, it's now my great pleasure to pass proceedings over to Associate Director, Alumni Relations, and our moderator, Tammy Akinaina.
Thank you so much, Anna. Good afternoon, everybody. Bienvenue à toutes et à tous. Wonderful. Hello and welcome to part 2 of our post-American election series. My name is Tammy Akinaina, and I'm the Associate Director of Alumni Relations here at Concordia University. As Anna mentioned, I'm today's MC and panel discussion moderator. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that Concordia's campuses are located on unceded Indigenous lands. The Kanien'kehá:ka Nation is recognized as the custodians of the lands and waters on which we gather today. Tiohtià:ke, or Montreal, is historically known as a gathering place for many First Nations. Today, it is home to a diverse population of Indigenous and other peoples. We respect the continued connections with the past, present, and future in our ongoing relationships with Indigenous and other peoples within the Montreal community. In the first part of this series, we discussed the direct aftermath of the November 3rd election and what Canadians could expect going forward. Since then, the election results have been confirmed and Joe Biden has won the White House. Today, our panel of experts will discuss the impact of the election results, explore some of the election's major themes, and break down what we can expect to see going forward. Our panelists today include the 2 Julias, who I will after this introduction refer to by their last names. Our alumni, Julia Wolfe, is a journalist and data visualization editor at FiveThirtyEight, and Julia Vargas Jones, a field producer with CNN in California. Wolfe and Jones met while studying journalism at Concordia and worked together on the student newspaper, The Link. Arvind Jain is a professor in our Department of Finance, and André Gagné is a professor in our Department of Theological Studies, and author of the book, Ces évangéliques derrière Trump, an exploration of Trump's evangelical support. I'm so pleased that you're taking the time to join us today. So let's get started by having each panelist introduce themselves and their area of expertise. So Wolfe, we'll go to you first.
Hi, thanks, Tommy. It's Julia and I are just messaging. It's nice to hear sort of our story together. Yeah, so I am the graphics editor at FiveThirtyEight. I manage a small team of visual journalists who help tell our stories with charts, graphics, and interactives, and as well sometimes jump in myself, and that's sort of my background. Before that, I was working in a few newsrooms in Canada, including my internship at the Montreal Gazette. And yeah, I got my start with Julia working at The Link, and really together figuring out how to transition The Link into a more digital forward publication.
Thank you so much. Over to you, Arvind.
Good morning, everybody. I'm delighted to be here. I'm a professor of international business and finance in the Department of Finance at Concordia. Uh, I guess the reason I'm on this panel may be because I do follow international economic events and perhaps read everything I can about what is happening between US and Canada. Or not everything, but I try and keep up with that issue. So maybe I'll be able to bring a little bit of perspective on that. My research happens to be in the area of corruption, which may not be all that relevant to this discussion, but if you want to, we'll talk about that. It's good.
Thank you so much, Arvind. Andre?
Hello, everyone. Thank you for this kind invitation. I'm full professor in the Department of Theological Studies, and my research focuses on the evangelicals that supported Trump. I just written a book on this, and I specialize in specific traditions related to evangelicalism, for example, neo-charismatics and Pentecostals, the relationship between religion and politics, also religion and violence, fundamentalism, and the reception and interpretation of the Bible in the modern world. So I'm glad to be here and to speak about these evangelicals that lent their support to Trump.
Thank you, Andre. Super excited. And Julia Vargas-Jones, over to you.
Hello, good morning, afternoon, everyone. I'm Julia Vargas-Jones. I'm a field producer with CNN. I'm based in Los Angeles. My current beat with CNN is hate groups and hate, but I also covered this last presidential election and lots of other breaking news events over the past 5 years that I've been with CNN in Los Angeles, New York, Atlanta, and before that, I was in Montreal, and I worked with Julia at the Link, got my start there. Also had that Montreal Gazette internship, and worked in radio stations and did lots of different things around the city before moving down to the US. I'm originally from Brazil, and came over to Canada to study at Concordia.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Jones. So last week, Joe Biden was elected the 46th president of the United States, defeating Donald Trump by what is likely to be several percentage points nationwide. More Americans voted in the 2020 election than in any other in more than 100 years, with nearly 65% of the voting eligible population casting a ballot. The margins in crucial swing states, however, were closer than polling averages suggested that they would be. Biden won the 3 Midwest battlegrounds, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, but major networks still took several days to call the election results. In what may be the least surprising development of his term in office, President Trump has now spent several days falsely claiming widespread voter fraud and launching lawsuits. At this point, Mr. Biden is the president-elect and will solidly carry the Electoral College. Barring dramatic, unforeseen developments, he will be sworn into office on January 20th. So just to begin, so that was me setting the stage of what we know so far and where we are now. Last week on our previous panel, Moshe Lander, who's one of our economists, spoke about the potential impact of the elections on the US and Canadian economies. Obviously, what happens in the US has a global impact. Arvind, what are some of the potential impacts of a Biden administration on the global economy?
I think to answer that question, we first should look at what has been the impact of Trump administration on Canadian economy. And fortunately, I think in spite of all the brouhaha that the bravado that Trump produces, I don't think Canadian exports to US have been hurt that much. Actually, we seem to have done quite well. If you like, later on in the presentation, I can show you some numbers that show that actually under Trump administration, our exports to US have increased and our trade balance with US has actually improved. We always had a surplus with US and that has increased. So will Biden make it better? I think Biden may reduce some of the uncertainty, but the fundamental economic forces are not going to change. And I think we may not see much of a difference in terms of our exports to the United States. And that is really the biggest impact we have is A, how much do we export? Do we have an export environment that is healthy? And B, what is the uncertainty surrounding that? That uncertainty will go down. I think Biden is likely to be much more predictable, much more stable than Trump, and not given to bravado. Other than that, in real terms, I am not expecting a very big change.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Arvind. We did get a quick question in from Norm, and I'll just slide it in since you just spoke about the economy. Norm asked, how do you explain the rise in the stock market when it was announced that Biden had won the election?
Is that directed at me?
Yes, sorry.
Okay.
Yes.
I think the stock market has been very unpredictable during the last few months, if you like, and the increase in stock market is not due to any changes in the economy so much as reduction of the uncertainty. What Trump has done is introduced a lot of uncertainty in the business environment and the economic environment, in the relationship between the US and the rest of the world. And Biden promises a much more stable environment for businesses. So this reaction to the stock market is not to underlying economic forces or economic changes, but to the uncertainty that Trump had created. Stock market works a lot on the idea of uncertainty, of the risk, the perceived risk that the business and the stockholders see. As when they see that risk going down, they are optimistic, they're coming back into the market. So I take that increase in the stock market, the performance of the stock market, as a reflection of the uncertainty being removed from the political arena.
Fair enough. Thank you so much. So, Andre, this next question is for you. As we know, evangelicals and the Christian right represent some of Trump's most staunch supporters, and this is a topic you are extremely familiar with. Can you talk about this phenomenon, what we should understand about this demographic? Can you place it in context for us?
Yes, very important part of the electors in the US are comprised of evangelicals. When you think that currently in 2020, there's 331 million people in the US, and 110 million of them self-identify as evangelical Christians. And that, when we talk about evangelicals, of course, we talk about a very complex group of individuals that is comprised of various types of groups that have different types of beliefs. But in a nutshell, it is an important part of the population, and presidents have to take them into consideration when they propose themselves as candidates for the presidency. Now, in the context of the Trump administration in 2016, 81% of white evangelicals had supported Trump. And there was an impression that that might change maybe after 4 years, especially with the problems related to the pandemic and other issues. But according to the preliminary exit polls, now we still have somewhere between 76% and 81% of white evangelicals supporting Trump, and from other minorities around 37%. So evangelicals are an important part of the electorate, and they play a significant role. They have, and I explained this a bit in my book, they have a particular view of politics that is often, for them, rooted in Christian nationalism, the idea that the US is founded on Judeo-Christian values, or that the US is a Christian nation. And of course, this is a particular reading that they have. But also they have specific concerns. Like just prior to the election, there was a poll conducted by a public religion research institute which listed the 3 top concerns of various religious groups. And for white evangelicals, the first concern was abortion. And after that, you had the issue of having fair elections, and then the issue was terrorism. Now, when you look at the other groups, the other religious groups that were involved in voting, almost all of the groups were very much concerned with how Trump had managed the pandemic. So that was a concern for them. So the white evangelicals have a different reality. They have different grievances. And that, of course, explains their support for Trump in 2020. He's delivered the key promises that he made to them. Conservative judges at the Supreme Court managed to get 3 elected Supreme Court judges. Also had over 300 federal judges appointed throughout the country. And of course, issues around religious liberty as they define religious liberty, and the careful relationship that they've entertained under the Trump administration between America and Israel. So these are all things why these evangelicals, and again, I'm going to end with this. It's not all evangelicals that necessarily supported Trump, but those that did, these are the main issues that made them cast their vote for Trump for a second term.
Thank you for that information, Andre. Do you have any idea of how many or the percentage of Trump's base of support, how much of that percentage is evangelical? Because Lewis had a question in the chat that said, I've read that evangelicals count for 27% of Trump's base of supporters.
Yeah, it's about, it's around 24, you know, depending on which surveys you look at, it's around somewhere between 24, 25, 20, those are the numbers. It's about a quarter of the electorate.
Yes, and I mean, you know, considering how many people actually voted, a quarter of, you know, 60 million is still quite a few people. So
it is a lot, but again, we have to stress the fact that not all evangelicals necessarily voted for Trump. Now, there were evangelicals that decided, despite the fact that they are pro-life, decided to vote for Biden, but that is a minority because they considered issues around pro-life to go beyond the notion of abortion. You know, just managing a pandemic in an adequate way is a pro-life issue. Taking care of the poor is a pro-life issue. And at the same time, when you think about these evangelicals, voting for Biden wasn't that much of an issue because they gained a major victory with having these 3 conservative judges, which shifted the balance of power in the Supreme Court. Now you have 6 conservative judges against 3 that are more progressive. So in a sense, even if Trump loses, a lot of these supporters won and got what they were hoping for.
Thanks, Andre. That's mildly depressing, but I understand.
Sorry about that.
That's okay. That's okay. I said in some of the dry runs is that we like to have, you know, economists and, you know, people here just to give us the hard facts. Certainly. Well, thank you for sharing that information. Our next question is about the news outlets calling the election. So, you know, on Saturday, actually, I received a note from Anna saying, you know, the election has finally been called in favor of Joe Biden. And I know that, you know, both Julias, Jones and Wolfe, you've covered elections in Canada and the US. So this first question is for Jones. Can you give us some insight? You know, you're a field producer in CNN, you're, you know, basically going over all the states as to why did it take so long? How does this work? Why did it take so long to get a result from some of the outlying states? Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Nevada, for instance. Can you talk to us about that process?
Yeah, absolutely. I was on the day after the election on Wednesday, I traveled to Nevada, and that's where I stayed for quite a few days after, as we were counting the votes. So I think one thing to keep in mind is that there is no one authority, electoral authority in the US that will call an election based on the results of national results, counting, county by county. This is a process that is done by each county and by each state. So, some states have more counties than others, like some states have like 80 counties, or like some of them will have 20 something. Each of these individual authorities has to complete their count, and they'll publish that information. News outlets, we are looking at each county individually, as I'm sure you all saw, my colleague John King doing. It's a painstaking process. So we are in touch with those election officials, sometimes multiple election officials in one county, and we are all, not just CNN, every outlet is like pestering them and trying to get that information out faster and faster. But the internet refreshes at the same rate for everyone. This is part of why it takes so long. You're going, each community is processing their results, and a lot of these places, they're doing it by hand, and they have to do it a bunch of times. And in some counties, that process happens over 24-hour periods, but in other places they close at 6 p.m. and people go home and they come back the next day. It really varies, and I think that it's not a homogeneous process. So I think that is one thing. And another thing is that this election cycle, so many people, for obvious reasons, voted by mail. And I think there are some counties that were used to doing that. Washington State has been doing voting by mail for 20 years or so. But for some counties, many counties, that was a new process, and they had to come up with new ways of doing that. They had never done anything like it before, and as much as they were preparing for it, they just might have not anticipated the kinds of challenges that they ended up facing for the days and, we'll see, weeks to come.
Thank you so much. Wolfe, I wanted to give you a chance if there was anything you wanted to add in there.
No, I think Jones summed that up pretty well. And this is something that we, both CNN and 538 and lots of outlets tried to warn about in advance, because we did know this was so likely. But it doesn't mean that when it happens in reality, that doesn't play on certain fears. That's
true. And so this is, again, you guys are both alumni of ours, and you've covered both of these. You've covered elections in Canada and in the US. What are the main differences you've observed covering US versus Canadian elections? Jones, do you want to begin?
Sure, I'll start. I think it's scale, right? It's time, it's money, it's just the amount of different states involved in it. Is the Canadian elections, the last one I covered last year, we were done, it was 6 weeks, right? So it was really fast. I went up to Montreal. We covered, big speeches. It was done the same night. We had everything. It was just like open and close. And that's one thing, the amount of money that's spent on campaigning. The first campaign event for 2020 that I went to was before Biden announced his candidacy so that was April of 2019. It takes a really long time. And I think that, and also the other thing, referring to what we were just talking about, is that Canada does have Elections Canada, and that provides, for us journalists, that's huge. We don't have to be calling the election. Someone will tell you, there's an authority that will tell you, so that doesn't fall on the media.
Thank you.
Yeah. No, all of that, definitely. I think a big difference is sort of the media polling blackout until the polls close in Canada. In America, you have things like exit polls, you have pollsters waiting outside voting booths, and people trying to do a lot of sort of reading of the tea leaves of what does that tell us? How awful were they? But in Canada, you don't have that. You wait till the polls across the entire country are closed before you get anything, which also adds to that sense of speed in terms of actual results, where it's not like you slowly have the East Coast coming in. And I remember when I was covering when the first Trudeau election, and you know, you saw the map sort of fill in over the course of like 20 minutes as opposed to several hours. So that really lends itself to a sense of polls are closed. Now we kind of know who won.
And thank you for sharing that. And it's actually a perfect segue because we would like to talk about polling, and you're the person to talk about polling for us here. So as we all know, polling plays a major role in US elections, and FiveThirtyEight is one of the most respected polling aggregation organizations in the game. So Julia, could you please explain to our audience how polling works, particularly for a major event such as a national election, and also what journalists like you do behind the scenes?
Yeah, absolutely. So I mean, how polling works, I think conceptually probably pretty straightforward. They're calling people across the country, asking them a series of questions, who you're going to vote for, and usually other issue-based questions like Andre's discussion about evangelical voters. And then the layer that pollsters will usually add on is a weighting to make that representative of the national population. So if they only speak to a small number of Black men in their sample, but they know that there is a larger share of Black men in the country, they'll weight their responses more heavily than groups that are maybe overrepresented. So that in the end, the numbers they get hopefully look a little bit more like the country as a whole. And that's where that weighting comes in, where different pollsters can really have more or less sort of skill or luck there. It's a really difficult thing to do well, to know what to weight. There's a lot of conversations after the 2016 election where pollsters weren't really weighting for education. And so they weren't taking that demographic factor very seriously. And it turned out that education was a really driving force for who people were voting for. And so this time around, they looked more into that particular kind of weighting. So for us, what we're doing is we're collecting polls. We're not a polling company ourselves. And then we look at the historical performance of these pollsters. We look at how far they are off from the reality over time, and we give them grades and our own weights to them individually for a polling average. So we can say, you know, CNN works, I forget the actual pollster CNN works with, but it's like very, very strong performance year over year. We're seeing that they invest a lot of money and thought and careful research into doing that well. So we weight a CNN poll really highly. Whereas some other pollsters that are moving a lot faster, that maybe we haven't seen as much success with their weighting measures, we're going to weight them a little bit less in our average. But ultimately, our belief is you still want a lot of polls, even if you have some maybe lower quality polls you're weighting less, and higher quality polls you're weighting more. Ultimately, that wisdom of the crowd's average is going to get you stronger and closer to reality than only using a couple pollsters to really get that sense of what's happening.
Okay, thank you. And, you know, in terms of, I know that you mentioned a little bit about in 2016, the national polls were off a couple of points. This year it does, or at least I know immediately after the election, my brother texted and said, we need to figure something out about polling. And I said, who are you? You work in banking, stop texting me. But certainly I know that, you know, people have lots of questions about this. Can you shed some light on this? And maybe it's, you know, talking a little bit about, you know, you did speak a bit about it, but FiveThirtyEight's approach to analyzing polling data, what people should really be thinking about, and what should, you know, interested observers really hang on to as the most important things to be aware of?
Yeah, so 2016's a really interesting one because actually at the national level, the polls weren't especially off. They were pretty in line with the average, actually below the average polling error. I think since 1970, I'd written these down, I don't have them memorized. Since 1972, the average polling error was 4.1 points at the national level. In 2016, it was only 3.1. So the actual error, the difference that we did see was in state polls. Because the truth is, like Jones had mentioned, the way that American elections are won is at a state by state winner take all level. So the national polling was pretty strong. Hillary Clinton did win the national vote in line with what those polls suggested would happen. But the bigger error in the polling was these state-specific ones where they were only talking to voters from Iowa. And those errors was actually had a 5.2 average polling error. So that's where you saw the problem, where they missed a handful of states because they had those larger errors. We're still trying to suss out a little bit what the errors were this year. I think for us, it's really important that we have those full certified results to really nail down the exact number of the average. I think there probably was some pretty significant misses we should talk about, but we're just trying to be cautious until we really have the full results to know where that is. And so I guess one caution I will give to people is there's certainly some people really going all in before we even had before the election was even called. Things that now maybe look a little bit premature when we see that certain states actually ended up pretty much in line where we thought when most of the votes were counted. So I would hold off on drawing really strong conclusions until we have a complete data set to work with.
No, that makes lots of sense. Thank you. And so Christina had a question in the chat a little bit about not polling, but moving one step further to the accusations of fraudulent voting. So what has been interesting for me, and I would probably say for a lot of other people, is seeing news media, news organizations saying, actually, there don't seem to be very many instances of fraudulent votes being cast or fraud being cast. So can either of you speak to, coverage of this, what we actually know and what you can share? So that's for Junes or Wolfe, whoever is swiftest to respond, certainly, can take this.
Arvin, if you want to, I can, I think Jones and I have different perspectives because she's really on the ground with people and we're thinking more nationally. I will say we are taking a pretty cautious stance. The Trump administration hasn't really met the barrier of proof to demonstrate that there was any serious issues of fraud. The lawsuits that they filed, with the exception of one very extreme, unlikely to succeed case in Pennsylvania, are pretty unlikely to be significant enough to even change the outcome, even if they did have merit behind them. So we're just being pretty careful and pretty clear that at this moment in time, there's no evidence of fraud that we're aware of.
Thank you.
Yeah, I didn't personally, my experience in Nevada, I believe there were 2 accusations in Nevada that the authorities were looking into of people who had allegedly been dead that had voted. So those were the only things that I was made aware of. And we were speaking with the local authorities for incessantly asking them about it. And those are the only instances that I personally saw. I can't speak to, this on a national level. It hasn't been something that I've been covering over the past few days, but, to Julia's point, I mean, we haven't seen any serious allegations.
Thank you. Arvin, did you want to add something to the conversation?
Well, I just want to point out that the number of people who are following or who are taking up Trump's accusations of fraud seriously is actually quite small. We haven't seen big riots in cities. We haven't seen a lot of people coming out on the street and saying, yes, Trump is right. There is a minority that supports him. That's totally, there are always, any population has a small number of people who just ready to take on anything. And I don't think these numbers are very serious. I think the report I saw from CNN actually was that about 60% of the Republicans are not supporting Trump on this fraud charges. So I don't know if we should take these charges very seriously. I hope nothing happens.
Thank you. And I certainly agree. I think it's just obviously, it's hard to parse all of the different headlines. It's hard to parse, especially, if you're on social media, I think Twitter has been appending notes to lots of Trump tweets about, the veracity of what's being reported. So, being, in the background or a Canadian observer, it can be difficult to try to sift through exactly what's going on. Certainly, in terms of our next question, it's really just kind of pulling together, this portion of the conversation. So we're going to open it up to Q&A in the next few minutes, but I did want to give you guys a chance to share just, from your areas of interest and expertise, what lessons can Canadians learn from, these American elections? And I think, the religious bit is very interesting, certainly. So Andre, we're going to give you a chance to start off here.
Yeah, I think for Canadians, it's very surprising to see the involvement of so many religious people, and how, there's a proximity between religion and politics, and how religion plays a significant role, and how politicians need to be aware of the religious voters, and also understand that, some of these groups that support Trump, and one of the things that I do in my book is I focus on a specific segment of evangelicals, which are neo-charismatic Pentecostal evangelicals. Some of them have exhibited, and this might be surprising for a lot of Canadians, they have exhibited very profound anti-democratic and anti-pluralist impulses in their comments, in the way that they envision exactly these results. A lot of them don't accept the results. A lot of them talk about fraud. A lot of them see Trump as a chosen by God. They see him as an anointed leader that God has chosen, despite his character flaws or whatever. For them, that's not important. God could use anybody. So it's to kind of understand this, and understand this kind of electorate, and see that even in the discourses that come out of some of these leaders, because of this profound anti-democratic, anti-pluralist tendency that you find in some of these groups, because of their Christian nationalist view of the country and how it should be run, based on the Bible, based on Judeo-Christian principles. Sometimes the rhetoric fuels ideas of civil war. They nourish that, and you don't know the consequences of what that can have on the peaceful transfer of power, for example. There's a recent poll that said like 55% of Americans are not really confident that Trump will concede the victory, and they're very, very worried about potential violence. Even if we're not seeing much, but if the final results come down, how will these people react, and how will they mobilize those that follow them? So I think that it's a lesson for us in Canada. We're a pluralistic society. We value pluralistic beliefs and practices. And in the US, it's supposed to be like that. But with some of these groups, that's not their vision of society. So maybe it's a lesson for us to be attentive to what's happening right south of the border of us.
No, definitely. Thank you, Andre. And Arvind, do you think, are there lessons that we should be learning from, the 2020 American elections, what we've just, been through essentially?
I think the lessons we may learn are perhaps connected to the election and the pandemic. I think the two issues sort of converge in the lesson that I am drawing, and what I am looking at is in the economic response to pandemic has been somewhat different, not very different, but somewhat different in US than in Canada. I think it has, if you look around the globe, I think where it has worked very well is where the government has come in to help the people, not the businesses. I think in US to a very large extent, Canada to almost the same extent, but not quite. The help has been given to businesses, not to individuals. And I think this is a different perception of how the economy works. I think we take the view that it's a trickle down. The businesses, if they're doing well, they will expand the business, or people will get the jobs. The view that has worked in some countries, especially in Scandinavia, etc., is if you help the people, they will create the demand that will get the economy going. I tend to think more in terms of that approach being a healthier approach. I don't know if this is a lesson from the US elections, but it is a lesson perhaps parallel to the US election coming from the pandemic. So
Well, thank you for sharing that, and obviously in our first conversation, we did have a lot of questions about the economy. So thinking about to whom the help goes and how that can jumpstart the rest of the economy is certainly really useful for people to keep in mind, and hopefully we would hope that our policymakers are also thinking along those lines and looking at what data they have. So for the Julias, we also have a similar question, but we did get a question coming in from the chat from Facebook, and so that question says, how will national news outlets cover the eventuality that Trump might not concede? So I don't know if either of you would like to speak to this. I see Wolfe nodding. So Wolfe, would you like to begin?
Sure. I mean, it's easier for us, I think, than CNN has a different, broader platform and an expectation to be covering the ins and outs more than we do. I mean, for us, we're focused on sort of what I think NPR has defined as like approaching these things with the truth sandwich, where you never present any of this information without both at the start of the phrase and at the end of it clarifying like what the reality is. So, though Trump is claiming X, there is absolutely no evidence for it. And never sort of divorcing that as just Trump said X or Trump said Y. I mean, ultimately, we will have states certifying their results as early as the end of this week. We will have electors voting in December. By the time we get to January 20th, there will sort of be a legal process beyond a media process that should be completed. So our focus will be covering that and looking forward to what we can say and what we know about a Biden administration, as opposed to playing too much into coverage of things that we don't consider to have a lot of ground behind them.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think similarly for us, or for me personally, we're not making plans for things that we don't know yet, and we're just hoping that there will be the least amount of disturbance to democracy as possible. For me, in my team, covering, we cover a lot of Trump supporters. A lot of people in these hate groups are Trump support. A lot of them are not. So we are continuing to monitor what they're saying. We are just keeping our eyes peeled to the kinds of events and demonstrations, and also the narrative. What kind of story are these groups telling themselves, each other, about what is going on in the country right now? We also have to be very careful to not, I saw that there was another question about, if there have been pro-Trump demonstrations in the last few days. I think that we have to be very careful to kind of, to use an analogy from Julia's piece, is that, we can't put more weight to something that just doesn't have that. So when we talk about the numbers, like, we don't know how many people might be in these events or might be demonstrating or protesting, in various Capitol buildings around the country. We don't know how many people will be, in Washington, D.C. in a march, but we have to just wait and see what actually materializes, because it's very easy for people on the internet to sound louder than they are. So I think that, for me, I'm just being very careful as I move forward to not assume that there is an impending civil war, that people would make a lot of noise over this. we might not see that. And I think that it's our job to, as journalists, to just observe this, like keep an eye on everything and just be prepared. But I don't want to create an expectation or create a narrative, like even in my head, that certain events will take place, because they very well might not.
Oh, that makes sense. And thank you for sharing that. And, you know, just to kind of take it back to the question that, you know, we started off asking Arvind and Andre about, in terms of lessons that Canadians can learn, I'm going to throw that to, you know, both of you, the Julias, again, because, you know, in the last few days of, say, you know, this Trump presidency, you know, we've seen some of these strategies. We've seen, as you mentioned, Julia, the truth sandwich in terms of, you know, this is what Trump has said, this is the reality. We've seen, you know, some media strategies emerging to share objective information, perhaps in a more, in a way that, you know, more people are able to tease out what is important. Are there lessons that, you know, Canadian journalists can learn from this election that you think are salient? Wolfe, would you like to begin?
Sure.
You were talking about.
Yeah. Yeah, both Arvind and Andre said such smart, intelligent things. I think both Jones and I had a mini panic. But yeah, talking about journalists, that's a little easier for me, I think. You know, I think we at FiveThirtyEight have learned a lot about our role in terms of how readers consume and perceive information, how they consume and perceive polling information, probabilistic information. When I worked at the Globe and Mail, we did do a forecast of the federal election, but since then they've stopped doing it. And I know Eric Garnier does some of that work at CBC, but otherwise there isn't quite that same culture, in part just due to what data's out there. But we have realized and learned that we have to take a much more active role in education about understanding and reading probability, about displaying, particularly as a visual journalist, we think a lot about how to show uncertainty and how to show a margin of error in a poll and how to explain what that means and how to really see ourselves not just as like, well, you know, this is the fact, so we don't have to get into the nuance, but that we have a certain responsibility to help explain that something can be 90% likely to happen. That doesn't mean that 10% won't. And I definitely think if, you know, the Canadian polling industry continues to grow, if there is more data, if, you know, the Globe returns to doing forecasting or other outlets look into that work, that really coming at it from a lens of how can we make sure that we're not just showing the numbers directly, but that we're really trying to be thoughtful about how we explain that nuance and how we make sure that we're being really clear about that nuance is so important.
Thank you. That was one of the comments that John had made in the chat as we were a little bit earlier, saying that he felt the polls may have been communicated as fact and that may have been misleading. So I think certainly a lot more people understanding, what agencies are communicating about what these polls may be saying, or as you said, for example, the weighting by education, or as Andre studies, evangelicals, being able to tease out some of these aspects so that it isn't, just taken as fact, perhaps, is certainly going to be really useful.
Yeah, you said a smart thing that made me realize another thing I wanted to add, which is that there was a history, a while ago of like data journalist being this niche. And I've seen journalists make jokes about how I got into this field because I don't want to do math. And it's a fun joke, but it's terrifying to hear because I think we are beyond a point where journalists can wash their hands of understanding the math. They don't have to be statisticians, but there is a certain responsibility we have with our platforms, and that in order to report these things responsibly, we have to understand some of how these things are aggregated, some of the math behind it.
No, definitely, I appreciate that. And
at least a little bit of Excel, right, Julia? It's like a basic understanding. I think that a lesson for Canadian journalists that, and not just for Canadians, like I would say that to anyone, is that we have to listen to everyone. And I think that speaking with people on the ground, which is, I guess is easy for me to say because that's what, I do every day, but when you go into rural Michigan and talk to folks, like they sound very different than they will in a, you know, in Manhattan or in LA. Or even in Chicago or like other major cities. I think that it's been, for me, it's been quite eye-opening to, and I feel very privileged to be able to travel around America and talk to people from so many different backgrounds. And I think that that informs not just my opinion on the specific stories that I am working on, but just of what the country looks like as a whole. And there's been, I think, a lot of conversations in the United States about diversifying newsrooms in ways that are not necessarily visible, right? Just like hiring journalists from different parts of the country and having those kinds of opinions and backgrounds of, you know, like someone that's from a rural county that might understand what those needs are, and even in terms of information and education, as Julia was talking about. I think that that would be, you know, my number one note for everyone is just like, don't forget parts of your country. Don't forget to like go and actually talk to people, you know, in the middle of nowhere. Just listen to what they have to say, because sometimes it's surprising and sometimes it's not. I mean, it might be exactly what you think it is, but I think it's worth giving people a chance to express their opinions and tell their story that isn't something that, you know, coming from the cities we might have made up in our heads ahead of time.
Certainly, I thank
like
you.
Those are the voters.
Yeah.
Can I add something to this? Because I think this is a fantastic point, in fact. Just in terms of evangelicals, how I've seen in the past 4 years, people just mock evangelicals for what they believe, you know, and there's all sorts of memes coming out and all sorts of things that are said about these people are stupid, they're prehistoric, they're medieval, you know, and without really understanding why they have these convictions, why they believe that, and why they support Trump. We need to understand that. When you think that 70 million people voted for Trump in 2020, that's a lot of people. That, you know, the country is polarized in terms of the vote. So, you know, this is what I try to do, even in my own work, is not just kind of say that these evangelicals or just, oh, you know, these people are wrong. No, but really understand what informs them, why they have this worldview, and maybe that will help us better communicate if there is any possibility of doing so. But there needs to be something on our side. If we don't share these perspectives, at least understand what these people are saying and why they're saying and why they're voting the way they're voting.
Thank you, Andre. I think that's really
Yeah, absolutely, Andre. And if I'm sorry, Arvin, go ahead.
Do
Go ahead, Arvin.
I continue?
Yes, please,
Tammy?
go ahead.
Okay. I think following up on what Andre is saying, it's sort of related, and I'm going to put my hat away as somebody who pretends to know a little bit more about economics than everybody else and speak as a citizen here. I think what is happening in US very, very clearly demonstrates the level to which politics can descend if it's allowed to descend, where you only care about your own view and nothing else. And that is a very dangerous tendency. I think I start with the assumption that politicians are not out there to look after you. They are out there to look after themselves. It's our job as a citizen to keep them honest. And to keep them honest, we have to look beyond the words that they are uttering and saying, oh, yes, I support, like Trump said, building a wall. Okay, that's one good thing I like about him. Therefore, I'm going to support him. No, I think we need to judge these politicians on their full character. Unless we do that, unless we bring some ethics back into our political decisions, we may descend in the direction of US, which I think is a very sad story, because it was, you know, US is usually seen as a bastion of democracy and all that, which you don't have to believe that. I think nobody seriously believed that, but at least it may not be a bastion of democracy, but it is about as good as it got for a long time. There were a lot less democratic institutions, countries in the world. But my point is that I think we need to, as citizens, take our responsibility, and that is to make sure that the politicians are doing the right thing, and we are electing the right politicians. We are selecting the right politicians by not looking at just at the words that they utter, but looking at their whole performance that they have done. So
thank you, Arvind. And I, I thought that it was just really important, and thank you all for sharing about the importance of listening to lots of different communities. And Julia Wolfe also pointed out that this is especially important for Canada. We have communities that can be physically very far from major urban areas. So making sure that we are, able to get, communication from those groups and to also frame it properly for those paying attention. And as Arvind said, for us citizens to really take that notion of good citizenry and being careful about who we vote for and paying attention to people's policies. So we do have, a number of questions came in, and this is going to be the last question. I know that, two of you are working journalists, so you may not be able to speak to this because, these questions are a little speculative, but there seems to be, a lot of concern around, worries about civil war. I know Julia said, Julia Jones mentioned that this isn't something that we can necessarily speak to since we don't know what will happen. But certainly there's a growing concern about whether electors can break from tradition and not cast their vote. So I don't know if any of you on the panel are able to speak to what does that actually mean? Is this something to actually be concerned about? Possibly can anybody frame this question from the audience for us? Roger was the one who asked that.
I'm sorry, I'm not sure I understand the question exactly. Can you?
Yeah, so the question from Roger said, can the electors break from tradition and not cast their vote as per the state votes? So this idea that, the Trump administration perhaps is asking, electors who may be Republican electors to go against, the will of the state when they have to cast their electoral college votes.
Yeah, I can't, like Joan said, I obviously can't predict the future. I will say this tends to be pretty unlikely because the vast majority of electors in this country are chosen by the party they're supposed to vote for. They are faithful to that party. When people have talked about faithless electors in the past, it's more like when Clinton wasn't going to win, they cast a vote for Sanders sort of as a protest vote, not that they switched to the other party. So I think it's very unlikely that somebody who in theory would have been really heavily campaigning with the Biden campaign, fundraising, is going to suddenly vote for Trump. That is, I guess, theoretically possible in some cases, but pretty unlikely.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much, everybody. It is the absolute last minute, so I'm going to turn this over to my colleague Anna, but it was really lovely to have you all here with us today. Jones and Wolfe, I hope you enjoyed a reprisal of your time at the link talking to the rest of us. And Arvind and Andre, thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us on your topics.
it's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
And I echo those thanks, and thank you, Temi, for once again exercising your expert moderation skills here with us today. On behalf of all of us behind the scenes from ForSpace and University Advancement, thank you to the audience members who have taken the time to join us today and for your participation in the chat and in the Q&A. I've just pasted a link to a survey in the chat if you want to give us some more feedback. We very much value your comments and look forward to producing more collaborative efforts together where we could kind of join forces, speak to alumni and our faculty members to bring you these great kind of moments where we can come together and converse. The recording of today's session will be available on our website, which is concordia.ca/4, maybe by tomorrow, early next week at the latest. So look out for that, and I'll send it to all the participants who showed up here today. So once again, panelists, your time and expertise has been greatly valued, your thoughtful comments. Thank you for being here. We appreciate you coming on board, and it's been a pleasure to speak with you all today. We wish you a great afternoon. Thanks a lot. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.